It begins with a gust of wind sweeping over an empty field, stirring the yellow grasses of a forgotten frontier. Long before the nation imagined its future, before borders were drawn or destinies declared, the land stretched wild and unbroken toward the horizon. The sun rose slowly over that enormous silence, warming the soil that had carried the footprints of mammoths, the ashes of ancient fires, the trails of migrating nations who walked long before any paper bore the name United States. Yet beneath this vast and indifferent sky, a chain of events was forming. Small choices, buried tragedies, unseen courage that would one day shape the contours of a country still waiting to be born. The story does not begin with the famous leaders whose names fill textbooks, nor with speeches carved into marble. It rises instead from people whose lives moved quietly through the overlooked corners of the continent. A French cartographer whose maps defined borders he would never cross again. A Shawnee hunter who sensed the earth changing beneath the weight of foreign boots. An enslaved girl who carried forbidden knowledge across plantations like an ember hidden in her chest. A struggling printer in Boston whose ink-stained hands would unknowingly set sparks in the minds of thousands. Their paths never crossed, yet their footprints pressed into the same soil. Their breath fed the same wind. Their small and private journeys flowed like tributaries into the great river of history. The river begins in 1689, in a cold New England winter so brutal that even wolves dared not wander too far from the forests. Snow piled against wooden cabins, turning roofs into sagging shoulders, struggling under the storm's weight. In the town of Newberry, where the Merrimack River moved sluggish beneath sheets of ice, a woman named Ellery Thatcher gathered firewood with trembling hands cracked by frost. Her husband was away on a coastal trading voyage, and her young son lay sick in a corner, his breaths shallow, rattling like broken reeds. Yet the wind carried with it not only the sting of winter, but the murmur of distant conflict. Whispers of shifting alliances, of European wars spilling across oceans, of native nations squeezed between empires that saw the continent not as home, but as prize. Ellery knew none of the high politics that shaped these whispers. She only felt their consequences. When the French raiders descended upon frontier villages that same year, burning homes, taking captives, leaving trails of ash where cornfields had stood, fear rippled through the colonies like a spreading crack across frozen river ice. Newberry lay farther from the frontier, yet rumors drifted into the town long before scouts arrived with warnings. Fear grew in the silence between chimneys, in the careful glances exchanged over barrels of salted fish at the docks, in the way church bells echoed longer than usual across the snow-covered fields. And through this landscape of uncertainty, Ellery Thatcher carried on, unaware that one of her descendants would one day stand on a faraway battlefield holding a flag that did not yet exist. But years before such symbols would matter, the continent churned under the weight of collision. Far south of Newberry, in the dense forests of the Ohio River Valley, the Shawnee hunter Niel moved like a shadow through the undergrowth. His world had changed rapidly in the span of 2 generations. The thick canopy still dripped with morning dew, the rivers still carved through limestone cliffs, the bison still thundered across prairies, but new scents, new metals, new diseases traveled with unsettling speed. European traders brought muskets, blankets, iron tools, and alcohol, trading them for furs worth fortunes across the ocean. Each exchange shifted the balance of power between nations that had lived on the land since time older than memory. Niel sensed the shifting currents. He felt them in the silence that followed the disappearance of certain herds, in the growing tensions between tribes forced closer together by colonial pressure, in the sudden appearance of foreign surveyors who measured the land in ways that made no sense to his people. One of those surveyors, a French cartographer named Jules Armand, moved with calculated precision along the tributaries of the Mississippi. His maps, detailed with almost obsessive accuracy, trace the arteries of a land his superiors hoped to claim piece by piece. Jules took pride in his work. Each shaded mountain ridge, each carefully drawn river bend was a testament to the thousands of miles traveled on aching feet. Yet beneath his pride lingered a quiet awareness that his maps were instruments of more than mere knowledge. They shaped desires. They provoked conflict. Every inked line invited someone to believe they possessed what others had lived within for centuries. He recorded the land, but could not record its heartbeat, its memories, its truths that evaded foreign eyes. Far to the southeast, in the plantations of coastal Carolina, an enslaved girl named Adira moved between rows of rice fields shimmering beneath relentless sun. She lived in a world defined by the lashes of overseers, the rhythm of water gates regulating the tidal rice, and the whispered stories elders told at night. Stories of ancestors taken from distant shores, stories of kingdoms and healers and resistance. Adira carried within her a sharp intelligence that she hid carefully. She memorized patterns in the stars, routes whispered by escaped slaves, the subtle signs of tides that could swallow or save a fleeing boat. She learned to gather knowledge quietly, as though collecting fireflies into a jar for a night when she might need their light. She did not know that her lineage, too, would one day intersect with the birth of a nation, not through fame, but through resilience carved into the marrow of generations. Across all these landscapes, icy New England, fertile river valleys, sweltering plantations, threads of the future twisted in ways none of them could yet see. Wars ignited across oceans would ignite here. Empires would rise and collapse. Entire peoples would be displaced or driven to resistance. And in the slow, grinding tension between expansion and survival, between power and freedom, between ambition and belonging, the story of a nation would emerge not through the triumphs of a few, but through the accumulation of countless untold lives. As the dawn of the 18th century crept across the continent, the wind carried with it the scent of inevitability. No single event defined the coming storm. Instead, it was built from small fractures: resentments between colonists and imperial governors, conflicts between native nations reshaped by disease and trade, the brutal economics of slavery that enriched some while destroying many, the relentless hunger for land that pushed settlers deeper into territories long defended with fierce devotion. And while these forces gathered strength, Ellery Thatcher tended a small fire to keep her child warm. Niall tracked deer through frost-covered underbrush. Jules Armand drew another precise line across his growing map, and Adira whispered ancient words beneath a sky glowing with coastal moonlight. None of them understood that history was already circling them, like a hawk riding unseen currents overhead. Yet the land understood. The land always understood. And it waited. The winter that had settled over New England began to loosen its grip as early thaw seeped into the soil, softening the hardened ground beneath Ellery Thatcher's feet. The river ice cracked first, groaning as it fractured into jagged corridors that drifted downstream like fragments of broken mirrors reflecting the pale sky. With each passing day, the town of Newberry stirred from its frozen stillness, but the shadows left by rumors and distant raids lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Even as woodcutters returned to the forests and fishermen stepped back onto creaking docks, an unspoken tension remained. It drifted between homes, settling into the marrow of the place, urging every inhabitant to glance more often toward the horizon. Ellery's son recovered slowly, his breaths gaining strength as the frost retreated, yet she felt the shifting world pressing against her small cabin walls. The colonies were no longer the fragile settlements of her grandparents' time. They were becoming pieces of a larger contest, pulled like stones inside the fists of powerful empires. Each year brought more settlers, more roads, more trade, and more friction. Somewhere beyond the familiar ridges, she knew the French and their native allies tightened their hold, while English settlers pushed aggressively westward, hungry for land they believed waited for them like a promise. But in Newberry, life continued in narrow rhythms, harvesting oysters, repairing storm-battered roofs, preparing for another cycle of planting and reaping. What no one could see, not even the most learned ministers, was that these small and quiet routines formed the surface of an enormous growing tide. Far from the colonial coasts where Ellery lived, the forests of the Ohio River Valley swelled with the scent of early spring. Beneath towering pines and maples, Niall moved through wet undergrowth as new green shoots unfurled from the softened earth. Animals emerged from their winter shelters, and the river swelled with snowmelt as though awakening from a long breath held too tightly. For Niall, the coming spring carried a heavier weight than any before. He had spent the winter listening to the elders speak of shifting alliances and southern tribes displaced from their river homelands. The pressure came from every direction: the relentless advance of colonial traders, the growing power of the Iroquois Confederacy, the tightening grip of European rivalries that stretched their iron fingers deep into the forests. Each encounter brought new complications, new decisions, new dangers. During his hunts, he often spotted signs that unsettled him: trees marked with unfamiliar surveyor symbols, footprints that spoke of outsiders, sharpened stumps where someone had cleared a path not used by the local nations. These indicators were small, almost insignificant on their own, yet together they formed a pattern he could not ignore. The land was being watched and measured by men driven not by tradition or need, but by ambition tied to distant capitals. Niall sensed the land resist these new imprints, as though the soil itself recoiled from the notion of ownership being carved into it with foreign ink. He carried these thoughts silently, weaving them into his steps as he followed a deer trail toward the river, uncertain how long the world he knew could withstand the pressure closing around it. Far to the north and west, Jules Armand sat beside a fire he had built on the edge of a windswept plain, his map unfurled across his knee. He warmed his ink between his palms, watching as the horizon dissolved into twilight. The prairie grasses swayed like a restless sea, and distant ridges glowed faintly under the last rays of fading light. With measured precision, Jules pressed his quill to the parchment, tracing the curvature of a river he had followed for nearly 50 miles. Each stroke seemed simple, yet he understood the depth of its consequence. These lines were not merely descriptions of terrain. They were claims, suggestions, temptations for generals and governors who saw the world as territories waiting to be ordered. The land he observed with reverence would soon be spoken of in terms of possession. Jules felt a quiet conflict gnawing at him. His training urged him to capture the landscape exactly as he saw it, but his conscience wrestled with the knowledge that he was recording contours that might one day be fought over, seized, divided. He had encountered native families whose hospitality softened the harshest nights, and whose knowledge surpassed his own in every measure. He understood that the rivers he charted had names older than the monarch he served, and meanings deeper than the ambitions of any mapmaker. Yet he continued to draw, compelled by duty and a private hope that understanding the land might one day prevent destruction rather than fuel it. As he worked, a gust of wind swept across the prairie, rippling the parchment, reminding him that the world moved with or without the ink he laid upon it. In the humid coastal heat of Carolina, the spring rains transformed the rice fields into mirrors of the sky. Tidal waters pulsed through the intricate system of levees and gates engineered through generations of African knowledge. Knowledge carried in chains across an ocean, but rooted in memories that refused to die. Adira walked barefoot along the embankments, her feet sinking into soft, wet earth as she inspected the rising water levels. The air shimmered with insects, and the calls of hidden birds echoed through the marshes. Though she labored under watchful eyes, her mind drifted far beyond the boundaries of the plantation. She noticed details no one else cared to see. How the smallest change in tide predicted the arrival of storms. How the soil texture revealed whether the crop would thrive. How the patterns of moss on the live oaks indicated shifts in season. She absorbed knowledge relentlessly, weaving it together with stories whispered in the quarters at night. Stories of cunning escapes, of resistance, of coded routes and signs left in plain sight. Adira understood she lived inside a system that sought to crush her spirit, yet she nurtured a quiet flame within her, a determination passed down by ancestors who had survived worse storms than the ones gathering now. Her life was defined by labor, but her purpose stretched far beyond bending over fields. Somewhere in the weaving of her private thoughts, she understood that endurance was not submission, it was preparation. While the young rice plant strengthened under the sun, the coastal winds carried rumors again, rumors of disputes between colonial governors and plantation elites, rumors of shifting markets, rumors of conflicts escalating along the frontier. The world that Adira inhabited seemed unmovable, yet beneath its surface, fractures widened with each passing year. She sensed change coming, not through the words of overseers or traders, but through the subtle tension that settled into the air, a heaviness that made the nights feel longer than before. She could not name the forces gathering, but she felt their approach like thunder rolling beneath the horizon. Across the entire continent, spring unfolded with deceptive calm. Settlers planted new fields, native nations prepared for seasonal hunts or diplomatic councils, enslaved laborers toiled beneath rising humidity, and surveyors continued pressing deeper into territory untouched by European maps. Yet beneath this veneer of routine lay an undeniable truth. The balance that had governed life in North America for centuries was tilting. Empires thousands of miles away maneuvered their fleets and armies, shaping events that would soon spill into the lives of ordinary people. Each person, Ellery, Niall, Jules, and Adira, carried on in worlds seemingly isolated, unaware of how closely their futures intertwined in the vast machinery of history. As summer approached, storms gathered across the continent with unusual strength. Thunder cracked over the eastern forests, lightning illuminated the plains, and tropical winds lashed the southern coasts. It was as if the land itself braced for the collision of worlds, sensing the weight of what approached. Conflict stirred beneath the soil, in the minds of leaders, in the choices of families struggling to survive, in the ambitions of empires hungry for control. The century had only begun, yet the seeds of revolution, displacement, endurance, and transformation already lay buried deep in the earth. And the land waited still, holding its breath as the first true tremors of change finally reached it. The storms that swept across the continent that summer left their mark in ways both visible and hidden. Trees split beneath the weight of lightning, riverbanks flooded, and entire fields flattened under the pounding of relentless rain. Yet the most profound shifts were not the ones seen in broken branches or washed-out paths. They were the quiet alterations in human lives, the slow turning of beliefs, the deepening of fears, and the rising tension that seeped into every corner of the land. In Newberry, the fields Ellery Thatcher tended with weary diligence began to sprout unevenly. The heavy storms had drowned part of the early crops, and the soil, oversaturated, released a damp, uneasy scent that lingered long after the clouds drifted away. The townspeople repaired fences, dredged flooded cellars, and listened intently to every traveler who passed through, hungry for news of events unfolding beyond their coastal world. Stories of raids along the frontier spread rapidly, accompanied by tales of settlers fleeing toward more fortified towns. Ministers preached with renewed fervor, urging their congregations to trust divine providence as imperial rivalries grew sharper and more violent. Ellery felt the uncertainty as she worked the land, her hands sinking into mud that refused to dry. She watched ships arrive at the harbor carrying goods from distant ports, sugar from Barbados, tobacco from Virginia, rum from Antigua. Each barrel and crate a symbol of the vast network that tied the colonies to worlds far beyond their understanding. Yet she sensed that ties could also become chains, binding the future of her children to powers they could never influence. The weight of this unseen force settled over her like a second layer of sky, pressing down with quiet inevitability. In the Ohio River Valley, the storms altered the landscape in ways that only someone like Niall could perceive. Trails that had existed for generations became muddied and nearly invisible. The thick forest swallowed light under swollen canopies, and animal movements shifted in unpredictable patterns. Niall walked the forest paths with measured patience, observing the signs with the trained sensitivity of someone who saw the land not as a resource, but as a living presence. The storms had churned the soil, exposing rocks and bones long buried, changing the scent and rhythm of familiar routes. In the aftermath of the rains, his people gathered for a council deep within the forest, where elders spoke of troubling changes. Displaced tribes moving north under pressure from colonial expansion, French traders bringing rumors of conflict, and whispers of English settlers pushing beyond boundaries previously agreed upon through fragile negotiations. Niall felt the weight of these discussions settle into his bones. The land was shifting not just physically, but politically, and he understood that their future would depend on choices soon to be made, alliances formed, territories defended, movements undertaken with the knowledge that losing ground meant losing heritage. Far to the west, Jules Armand continued his meticulous work, charting rivers swollen from the storms. He moved through territories where few Europeans had ventured, sketching landscapes shaped by forces far older than the ambitions of any empire. Yet the storms slowed his progress. Roads became impassable, ferries were swept away, and swollen creeks turned into dangerous torrents. He recorded these changes with scientific precision, noting altered river depths, shifted channels, and flood-prone areas. Jules admired the resilience of the land, even as he documented its temporary wounds. The storms revealed its unpredictable nature, its refusal to submit entirely to human understanding. But while he worked, the French camps he occasionally visited hummed with tension. Soldiers spoke of British advances along disputed territories, and officers argued over strategies that would determine which empire controlled vital trade routes. Jules remained at the margins of these heated debates, his role that of observer rather than participant. Yet he felt the unease in the air, an unease that crept into his evenings as he studied his maps by firelight. The lines he drew were increasingly becoming lines of confrontation. In the humid world of the Carolina rice fields, the storms brought both destruction and opportunity. Floodwaters swelled beyond what the field gates could contain, forcing Adira and others to work tirelessly to reinforce embankments and redirect tides that threatened to drown the entire crop. The marshes seemed alive with the sound of rushing water, croaking frogs, and insects rising in massive clouds that descended upon the workers with relentless hunger. Adira moved swiftly along the narrow paths between fields, adjusting gates and clearing debris with a practiced efficiency that belied her young age. The overseers watched closely, anxious about the potential loss of profit. But Adira saw more than just the immediate crisis. She saw how water carved new channels, how soil shifted, how certain embankments weakened. She stored each observation in her mind like a thread added to a growing tapestry of knowledge. As the storms passed, she sensed a transformation not just in the land, but in the enslaved community itself. The hardship forced cooperation, communication, and shared vigilance. In the dim light of the quarters each night, she felt an unspoken unity strengthen, a unity born from endurance and sharpened by shared suffering. Across the continent, the remnants of the summer storm settled into the earth, feeding crops and forests alike. But the true storm was gathering elsewhere, in the halls of distant governments, in the ambitions of rulers who saw the new world not as home, but as battlefield. French and British officials maneuvered like chess players moving pieces across a board neither fully understood. Their decisions, made in lavish courts across the Atlantic, would soon define lives unfolding quietly in forests, plantations, towns, and prairies. Autumn crept across the land with cool winds that carried the scent of dried leaves and early frost. Migrating birds cut patterns across the sky as they moved southward. Forests ignited briefly in brilliant shades of orange and red before surrendering their leaves to the approaching winter. Each region felt the shift. Newberry prepared for another cold season. The Ohio Valley pulsed with wary anticipation. French camps reinforced their positions, and Carolina plantations braced for the labor-intensive harvest. Change moved beneath these cycles like an undercurrent, subtle yet irresistible. Empires drew closer to collision. Native nations faced choices that would alter generations. Settlers pushed deeper into contested lands, and enslaved people nurtured the seeds of quiet defiance. The continent exhaled slowly as the first frost touched the ground, unaware that the century ahead would bring one of the most profound transformations in its long history, an upheaval born not from a single event, but from countless lives, unfolding, reshaping, resisting, and enduring. And though winter approached again, the land did not sleep as it once had. It waited with sharpened awareness, sensing that the next storm would not be of rain or wind, but of people and power, fire and iron.